There you go. And now I can share my screen and we'll try and see why I think, and we all think here, that languages are brilliant. On this slide, you can see all the languages that are actually on offer for a degree in the 5 universities having linked for today's session. You can see at the bottom, Lancaster University, University of Liverpool, MMU in Manchester, Manchester University as well, and the University of Chester. So you can see that some languages are quite common and some are a bit more rare, let's say. For example, the Basque, the Catalan, Arabic, the Polish, Portuguese, Russian, Japanese. And therefore, you can see that you have a multitude of options. And these are only the one you can do a degree in. With extracurricular lessons, you can do more than that. I know, for example, in Lancaster, we offer Dutch. So that's not very common, but there you go. Okay. Now, why should you do languages? Well, in my opinion, the first reason is, ta-da! You see the world and you discover the world, and the world is beautiful. Okay. Those pictures were all taken by our students on their year abroad. So when you do a languages degree, and our students will talk about that a little bit later, you don't do a degree in 3 years. Most of the time you do a degree in 4 years. A lot of people may think, well, I've wasted a year because I'm starting to work later, okay? Well, actually, I disagree with that because the year abroad is actually a great strength on your CV. When you apply for jobs, you will actually be able to say that you've done a work experience or that you've studied in a university, not only in a university, but actually a university abroad, or you will have done an internship or 2 internships in different countries abroad. So this can only be positive. Randomly, I'm not going to go through all the pictures, but here you can see on the top left corner, some students went in China. The 2 in the middle at the top are actually in France. On the left, you've got the Promenade des Anglais in Nice. On the right, you've got the Grand Palais, where the fencing will take place next year for the Olympics. On the right-hand side, you can see a student in front of a very colorful building there. That's a church in St. Petersburg. And at the bottom, a building that I visited and that I loved, the Pyramid of the Sun, near Mexico City in Mexico, in South America. And that's a student actually that I taught last year. As you can see, the great thing about traveling when you speak the language is you're independent. You don't rely on people. You don't rely on a guide. You don't rely on a book that may be wrong or that may not have the same interest as you. If you speak the language, you will know about the culture. And you will know about the culture, therefore you will know what you're looking for. And you will enjoy the country firsthand. You won't need anyone. Now, there are other advantages. For example, when we talk about globalization and the global world, there is the global diplomacy, of course. On top of that, there is the global economy, which means that if you work for a company, even if you're based in the UK, it's very likely that at some point you will need to deal, well, your company will need to deal with companies or countries which do not necessarily speak English. If then you can offer the language, you're in a good position. Your employability is multiplied because at the minute in the UK, there is a drop in the amount of people studying a language, which is the reason why you should consider languages for your future, because there are fewer people speaking it, and yet there is a higher demand. Why a higher demand? Well, part of it is the second point there. You can see the Brexit, the relation to the European Union. Because now, when you want to export or import from and to the European Union, there are a lot more paperwork. Where there was no paperwork needed because you could just export and import across the European Union, Now, because of Brexit, you actually need to fill in some paperwork, which means every single thing you send to Europe, every single thing you bring in from Europe will need some paper to go with it. And sometimes it will be multiple papers. Let's say that you're sending something to Poland and you will cross Germany or you will cross France. You will need those paperwork in different languages. And therefore, if you can speak those languages, you will be able to save money to your company. If the company saves money, you will get the promotions quicker than the others. Okay? Now, that's about employability. Clearly, if you speak a language, you will be more interesting for some companies. Why? There are other skills that you will develop as a language learner. First, the communication. In most lessons, you are asked to listen and to be quiet. I'm fairly sure that's true. In most language lessons, though, I'm fairly sure that your teachers always encourage you to speak in the target language, to answer questions when you do a listening exercise, or to answer questions in the target language when you do a reading exercise. All this is very interesting and will develop skills that you can use and you can transfer into other subjects. Because talking in front of, I don't know, today there are 62 teachers here with your schools. And well, even our students are used to speaking in front of maybe not such great numbers, but if you speak regularly in front of a class, you won't be impressed when you have to speak in front of clients of your company, in front of colleagues, maybe for training purposes, or in front of anyone. And when you apply for a job, you won't be scared of speaking in front of a panel of people because you are used as a linguist to talk aloud in front of people. Second point is about teamworking. Teamwork is essential in languages. And it's also essential when you apply for a job. You will see, I promise you, in the future, every single job you will be interested in will say that requirement can work as part of a team. It's really important. And linguists do it better. Why? Because you are used to looking up words when you don't know a word, or you are used to performing role plays or answering questions. Even working and rehearsing your questions, for example, for the GCSE, will be team working. And therefore, you'll be better than others who have not done the language when it comes to work and other skills. Interpersonal skills, very important. Skills, how you interact with people. How you interact with people is also a notion of respect. As you can see, I'm trying to look at my camera. I'm also looking at my presentation, but I'm basically looking in that direction. If I took out my phone to check my Facebook account, or if I started taking pictures or talking to my colleagues, that wouldn't be very nice. That wouldn't be very respectful. That's interpersonal skills. But not only are you good as a linguist with interpersonal skills, you're also very good with intercultural skills because we all have small differences. Our culture is different. Yes, it's not better, it's not less interesting, it's just different. And when you learn the language at school, your teachers who are specialists, who know the culture of the countries, can actually help you. Even if you teach yourself a language on your own, I'm doing it with my phone at the minute, with Japanese. I don't have the cultural background, and that's a problem. Therefore, make the most of it. You have a teacher who is an expert in the culture and the language. Make the most of it. Presentational skills, well, as you can see, we all do it when it comes to languages. And not only can we do the presentation in front of a panel of people, we can usually deliver it in several languages. And that's a strength, believe me, because a lot of people are not able to do it. You can do it. Problem solving is something you're also used to, because when you started learning the language, usually about year 7, maybe year 6, you knew what you wanted to say. You knew what you wanted to describe if I gave you a picture to describe in English or in your mother tongue, if it's not English. But then it's always very frustrating to have the skills to talk about something and not to have the vocabulary or the structure of the sentence in the foreign language. But you learned and you know how to deal with that problem. You can use a dictionary. You can ask your teacher. Most of the time, you've got a glossary at the end of the book. You can use your notes. Make sure you do not use Google Translate. Google Translate is bad for you, okay? Because it will not have the grammatical knowledge to translate very well. It will translate word for word, and it's not as good. I can recommend Word Reference, for example, if you want to use an online tool. And the last 2 points are linked: organizational and independent learning. Learning a language is a way of life. It's not just what you do in class. It's what you're interested in. For example, if you want to improve your French and you're a big fan of football, maybe you can follow the Olympique de Marseille, which is a very, very good team in France, or Lyon, which is also a good team in France. Okay? If you want to study Spanish, well, Real Madrid, probably you can follow them online. And you can also watch all the games thanks to the TV. If you're not into football, not a problem. Your favorite series is probably available in the language that you're studying. Or you can even discover new series that you didn't know existed. And that would be a great way to improve your language, by watching TV or by reading magazines or reading articles, by just going on social media maybe. You could actually be improving your skills. That's why languages are great, because you will improve and you will work on your languages without even realizing it. And you will perform and you will manage. Anyone who wants to learn a language can do it. Now, learning a language is also about the open-mindedness and the multicultural life. My colleague Sonia is going to share a poll with you in a minute. And in this poll, we're going to ask you to answer a few questions about languages. And Sonia, thank you very much. There you go. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to answer those questions. You will see that there are 4. So first one is, how many languages are there in the world? How many languages are there in Europe? Which languages has the most native speaker, according to you? And how many languages are spoken in your school? Okay, so, there's a surprise for first question. How many languages are there in the world? And you said with a majority of 57%, about 3,500. Well, this is actually wrong. There are more than 7,000 languages around the world, which is quite fascinating, really. So if you want to learn, you can always learn. There must be one for you there. How many languages are there in Europe? Okay, about 200. Okay, vast majority of you got it right. Okay, there are 24 official languages at the European Union, but of course there are a lot more languages. Okay, now which language, has the most native speaker? Again, you are the vast majority correct, with 86% having said Chinese, which is true. Okay, how many languages are spoken in your school? And that's quite fascinating to see that there are schools where more than 20 languages are being spoken. Okay, that's great. As you can see with this poll, you are surrounded by different cultures. Okay, maybe you were not aware of that, but multiculturalism is all around us. And it's great because it gives you a different perspective and a different angle on things. Now, let me go back to my next slide. Some of you may be wondering, and that's a stereotype, of what can I do with languages? If I do languages, I can do two things, translator or teacher. Well, look at that. Apparently about 20%, a little bit less than 20% of people working in HR, in finance and in business have done a degree that included a language. 15% of marketing, PR and sales professionals did a language degree. What about retail, catering? Almost 12%. Clerical, numerical clerk, secretarial, 12.5%. As you can see, languages are not refraining you from doing anything. They actually open doors. Whatever you're interested in, you can do it better because you can do it in a second language. That's how great languages are. And when I say second, why not? As we've heard from Oliver and Louis saying that they do French and Spanish. So they could technically work in about 30 different countries. Not bad. Okay. Then let's see. So we've got opportunities when you have good language skills. Okay. We'll ask our student ambassadors in a minute. Okay. I'm just going to finish with the presentation and then we'll ask our student ambassadors. Do not hesitate if you already have questions to put them in the chat or in the Q&A actually, which is on purpose there. We'll try to answer all your questions if we can. Now, you wouldn't be the first one to become bilingual. Yeah, it's a list of people who can actually master several languages. J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter's mom, she can speak several languages. Paula Radcliffe, this one is a long-distance runner. The one, Julia Donaldson, who wrote The Gruffalo, for example, she speaks fluent French, okay? Fiona Bruce, who's working on TV, can speak French and Italian. And the last three are probably people that you know the most. Bradley Cooper actually did his year abroad in Aix-en-Provence, in the south of France. The King, Charles III, can actually speak fluent German. And I know from a personal experience that he actually speaks French as well. Because I actually met him once when I was invited by the Queen at Buckingham Palace, which is true, by the way. Pep Guardiola can actually speak more than most people because he speaks Catalan and Spanish. And because of his job, he also speaks Italian, French, German, English, and a little bit of Arabic as well. Now, when it comes to languages, we'll ask our students, ambassador, in a minute what they actually study, which module they study. But this is the variety of modules you can actually do. When you study a language, it's not just about the language. You can talk about culture of anti-racism in the Caribbean, about the gender and diversity in North Africa, about religion in Japan, about cinema, music, and well-being in various countries, as you can see in the second column there. Or you could also be working with disability in Africa, or a political subject at the bottom, the art of resistance, about the far right in Austria there. So really, there's no reason why not to choose a language. Now, I told you about the world being diverse. How diverse do you think it could be? What is the sound of a bee? A bee surely makes the same sound, whether it is in Australia, the USA, or France. And yet, look at that. The sound of a bee, the way people perceive it, is very different. In English, you hear bzz, same as in French, more or less. In Turkish, they hear viz. In Japanese, people hear bun. In German, and Sonia will excuse my accent there, people say zoom zoom. Okay? In Korean, it's boing. I don't hear boing. And yet some people will hear bong. Okay? We chose the bee, but it could have been the cockerel. A French cockerel goes cocorico when a German cockerel goes kikiriki. And I have no idea why an English cockerel goes to leave. I've never ever heard that. A wild cockerel, never. But you see, it's all about tolerance and understanding that there are several point of views. Now, what can you study in combination with a language? Here is a list of all the subjects you could combine your language with across the Northwest University that are organizing this session today. Again, we'll ask our student ambassadors in a minute what they actually study, but you can see that there are some surprising topics, maybe politics, business, history, tourism, biochemistry, genetics, psychology, math, zoology, law, theater, biology, archaeology, music. There's no limit. Honestly, you can basically do anything you want. So why not do it? Now, let's move on to our students ambassadors and let's see if you have any questions for them. Okay. So I'm going to first ask our student ambassadors. I'm going to start with Lana. What do you study? Which module do you study? And why did you choose to study those modules, particularly, of course, focusing on the language? Please.
Of course. So I did my undergraduate degree in English and French, which worked quite well together because alongside doing your language modules, you do your culture modules, and that kind of tied in a lot with what I was doing in literature when it came to looking at things such as the colonial history of France and as a result, all the places around the world that speak French now. And then also it kind of went hand in hand with linguistics. I really was interested in psycholinguistics and child language acquisition and how we learn a language anyway. So as I was learning a language, it was pretty helpful to have that parallel. In terms of the modules I chose, so in first year you get modules that are a bit more broad. So you get like an introduction to French studies, and you kind of get a broad scope of different tasters. And then in your second and final year, you can be a bit more specific in what you choose. So I went down the route of kind of media and art and theatre. And I really enjoyed, there was a module I did in my second year, which was called Art and Violence in Metropolitan France. And when you hear the words art and violence, you automatically think of protests and kind of, I guess, more graphic images. But actually what I found the most interested in it was looking at the Charlie Hebdo publications and looking at questions of free speech and things that I was looking at in English literature, but was then applying it in a French context, which I really, really enjoyed that. And then in my final year, I did translation project, and well, a lot of translation at the beginning, you have to learn different theories about it and kind of experiment in that way and what different types of translation there is and what the purpose of a translation is. I luckily got the rights to a book that was actually came to fruition because of lockdown. So there was a comedian who, she went viral with these characters she created online, and I had just followed her basically to keep up my French and my interest in it, and it actually ended up getting published into a book, and I got the rights to translate it for my final year. So I chose that particular module, and then I went down that way because I really enjoy theatre and drama and comedy, and I was able to find that interface between learning my language, so learning French, and also getting to be creative in translating and creating characters and cultural references that would ring true for a UK audience as they would for a French audience. And yeah, so that was some of the modules I chose that I really enjoyed for my undergraduate years.
Okay, thank you, Lana. Okay. Louis, what module do you study and why languages?
Okay, so I followed a very similar path to Lana. In my first year, I do French and Spanish. So in the first year at Lancaster University, you do not only classes for learning, improving your level of the language in terms of like the CEFR levels going through B2 up towards C1, that kind of development. But also you do modules towards enhancing your cultural experience and knowledge to also then bolster your language learning. So it feeds back into it, because when you can put into context, which is what it was called languages in context at Lancaster, when you can put your languages into the context of how they came about, what kind of changes in history led to changes in different areas where the language is spoken, it just really helped me personally be able to understand the development of what it was I was learning. And going through into second year and into my last year, which was in between, obviously, the year abroad that we do, we get to, as Lana said as well, pick more specified culture modules. Last year, I did two modules, one for Spanish and one for French. And for Spanish, I did a module called Masculinities and Violences. So again, similar to Lana in terms of violences, but in film. So what that was a module where we would look at different films produced in Spain and also in Latin America. So we saw examples of a Mexican film and a Chilean film, and it would show not only the different techniques used in the filmmaking process, but also how those different violences and how the image of masculinity translated from Spain to Latin America. And it was following the kind of pattern whereby Spain's imagery and culture was a lot more restricted, and people were not very outspoken in these films that were being shown, a very kind of quiet violence, whereas in Latin America it was a lot more active and flamboyant, and the kind of typical uber imagery that we have of South America, where it is very active and lots of color and flashing images, and it was that kind of experience as well translated through the film. So that was very interesting. And for my French, I did a module called Modernisms and Madness, which was looking at particularly the evolution of how mental health was first recorded and just became aware of in France in particular. So that was looking at how original scriptures, which were people, doctors in early mental health institutions would note, and how their perception of what mental health was and what madness, as they described it, was, in comparison, obviously, to our more modern viewpoint of mental health, was so different, and how for them it almost seemed like alien, extraterrestrial taking over of people's minds was this madness, because they had no previous understanding for it. So it's that cultural development that we've seen, obviously, because we're a lot more developed as a society in today's terms, in terms of what we understand about mental health because of the progression of medicine. But it was just really interesting to see not only how it was noted, but also how it was described using the language, because these were things that were previously unspoken about. So they had to come up with new terminology, and we looked through the processes of how they went about that, how new language defining terms were introduced and how that was shaped. And it was really, really interesting. Okay. And alongside all of this, I had a dissertation, which we do at Lancaster. If you don't do a translation, we do a dissertation. And that dissertation was to do with another historical element, being resistances in South America towards oppression. So that was kind of linked back in with the violences that I'd done in that module.
Okay, thank you, Louis. And finally, Oliver. And because questions are already coming in, I'm also going to ask, I know, Oliver, you haven't done your year abroad yet, okay? But could you actually say what you're intending to do when you do your year abroad on top of that? And I'll go back to Lana and Louis, who have completed their year abroad.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm not so sure of it, hence why I chose languages in the first place. I wasn't so certain where I wanted to take my career. And I just thought I had a real interest in languages in secondary school and discovering these different parts of the world. Excuse me. And I think that's sort of my plan with the year abroad as well. I'm kind of learning. I learned in first year, and I'm continuing to learn this year all about these different places in the world that speak French and Spanish. And I know I'm slightly running out of time now, but I'm kind of using that as a way of determining where I'd like to visit and what I'd specifically like to do. I want my two experiences to be be very different if possible. I know it's not always the case with how you're restrained to where you can go and what you can do, but to experience a big city in one of the places and maybe a smaller rural vibe in whatever country it is that I go to is my aim, at least, for what to do. And I think my studies this year, just to go on to the modules that I might be studying, if that's all right. I'm studying, I thought what was really exciting in secondary school was that I learned a lot about France and I learned a lot about Spanish in those studies. But I felt like it was somewhat lacking in terms of, it's spoken so broadly with Spanish in South America, and then French with all of the little islands dotted around the world that you don't really know about at that stage. And I wanted to learn more about that. Hence, my one of my main modules for Spanish this year is the history of Latin America, and I think it's a really sort of, at least in England, you just don't really know maybe stereotypes and general things that you might see in the news, but you don't know the true reality of life there and how it came to being. And a lot of it is just written and learned through English history, the likes of Christopher Columbus and things like that. You learn a lot about what actually happened there. Was he the first one to go, which and other questions like that. So yeah, I'm letting my studies dictate my interest and push me in a direction that I'd like to go in, basically.
Okay, thank you very much. And going back quickly to Lana and Louis about your year abroad, where did you go and what did you do?
Yes, so I went to a town called Martigues in the southeast of France, which is northwest of Marseille. It's kind of in between. There's Aix-en-Provence. You saw when there was the information about Bradley Cooper. It's quite a student city there. So Martigues is just a little bit away from that, like an hour on the bus. But I chose, I put my preference down to be in a smaller area, mainly because I really wanted to be somewhere that didn't have any English speakers, and I really had to live my life in the French language. I went for the option of language assistantship. So I did teaching in a nursery and a primary school for my year abroad. I really enjoyed it. And honestly, teaching really isn't a career path I think I'm going to go down in terms of what I'm going to do next. But I really, really enjoyed it for my year abroad, and I learned so much from the kids. That was one thing that when you are considering a year abroad, you're thinking like, how will this help me? Will I enjoy it? And I really enjoyed working with the younger kids, especially because it kind of got rid of that initial shyness, because with the kids they just kind of told you if they understood you, and they let you know if you said something funny. I also, I picked up some funny ways of describing things as well, because these kids were also learning French as well. Obviously they spoke it at home, but they were learning all the ins and outs of things too. So that was really enjoyable for my year abroad. And then on my year abroad I also took up some part-time work in a restaurant. So I got hired as the cook, actually, in a bistro, and very quickly I kind of just was in the deep end, fast-paced environment, and learning a lot about French culinary terms, and that sort of thing. And it really showed me that I can make a life for myself anywhere if I really put my mind to it, I guess. And it was one of the most culturally enriching experiences as well, because where I was, there was quite a lot of immigrants that came from Tunisia, from Morocco, from Armenia. And so I got to really immerse myself in that culture as well, North African culture. And also I tutored a family who were, the mother was originally from Madagascar. And that actually helped me with a lot of understanding of, I guess, idiosyncrasies of other French-speaking countries, rather than, obviously, when you think of French, you think of the received pronunciation in France and Parisian French. But I got a lot of tasters of how the language works around the world, and also different accents and different terminologies, especially Marseillais terminologies, or they're very proud of their language there and their accent. So yeah, that was my year abroad experience.
And Louis, I know that yours was very different.
Yeah, so instead of doing a work placement, I did two study placements. So that means that I spent half of the academic year in a university in France, and I spent half of the academic year in a university in Spain. So in France, I was in Rennes in the northwest, and for Spanish, I was in Spain, obviously, and I was at the University of Cordoba, just at the top of Andalusia, basically. And it was two amazing experiences. I think in terms of the process that helped me the most, it's more the fact, because I know obviously people think, oh, okay, so you're going to university, so you're not really doing the work experience, so it might not look as good on the CV, and that can be a bit of a put off factor for people. But I think the sheer exposure that you get by just being essentially a French student and a Spanish student, because when you go to these countries and you work and study in their universities and you enroll yourself and you pick their courses, you're one of them. They don't necessarily realize, unless you make it really obvious because you ask people all the time or whatever it might be, they don't know that you're there for your year abroad. They just assume that just like anyone else, you're just studying like they are. So you sit down in their classes, you listen, you do the same work that they're doing, you take the same exams that they're doing. It's an experience that you wouldn't really get anywhere else, obviously, because when you learn the language in England and you learn the different processes of it, it's great and that's brilliant. But then being sat down in a classroom, being spoken in Spanish by a native Spanish teacher, and you're having to kind of adjust your brain to get used to that, but also take in what's being said and make notes and be a student. It's a really unique experience that I really honestly couldn't recommend more. And I think in terms of kind of, as Lorna said, you kind of do get a bit thrown in the deep end. I know it's a different area, obviously with her working and me studying, but it's that kind of, your brain clicks into a different gear and just, it forces you to adapt almost quicker than you realize. And I think the main thing that I've started to notice quite early on in both situations is that I was listening and my brain was hearing what was being said and listening to it in Spanish, but it wasn't having the need to then flip it back into English for me to understand. It was just being heard and being understood. It was like I was a Spanish and French student. It was really, really amazing. Really, really, really good.
Okay, thank you, Louis. A question has disappeared from the Q&A, and the question was about did any of you work on your year abroad? So as the year abroad tutor here in Lancaster, there are three options. So you've heard the first two, being a language assistant or studying in one or two different countries. When you do a work placement, an internship, you basically choose whatever you want to do. To give you an idea, this past year, we had a student who was doing his placement in Madagascar because he studies for ecological studies, and he wanted to work in a place where he could be with animals and protection of animals and all that. And together, we actually found a place in Madagascar. The year before, a couple of years ago, sorry, we had a student who worked in a school in Quebec. So that was just two examples to answer the questions. Now, Louis has already answered the question which is asked by the year 7 of St. Peter's Middle School there. But I'm going to ask Lana and Oliver now. When you speak another language, does your brain go back to English? That's always something that people ask. Lorna.
Yeah, so I guess at the beginning when you're getting into it, you are kind of doing that shift between the two languages. And I don't quite know when my brain made the transition of starting to think a bit more in French. I guess you kind of just try and implement it as much as you can into your normal daily activities. And for me anyway, I found that now I tend to, even if it's like syntax or something. If I've done something in French, for example, if I've just read an article in French and then I go to speak to someone in English, I tend to almost do like a French syntax in the English, like in the sentence for and some of actually a lot of my friends when I came back from my year abroad had said to me I was speaking strangely because I was speaking so properly in English because I was so used to actually just doing my daily conversations in French. So I guess it also depends on what your environment is. For me, I kind of have more when I'm now writing in French, I tend to think a lot more in French. Like, for example, if I was talking about somewhere like where somewhere is situated, I remember someone had asked me where were you on your year abroad, and I said it found itself, which is like in French you say se trouver is like the verb, but you don't. It says very strange in English. But I was like, oh, it found itself here in this area. And then was like, wait, no, that's like me trying, that's like, so it kind of went the opposite way around for me, really. But I think that's like what language learning is. You kind of just have all this vocabulary and your brain's making sense of it. But yeah, I guess after really being immersed in it, I think when I don't really switch in between the two anymore. They kind of just are there as like an amalgamation, really. So that's my answer for that one.
Okay, and if I can ask, just before asking Oliver, Lorna, staying with you, in which language do you dream? That's another question from someone in the chat.
Sure. So I've definitely had dreams in French. I dream in both languages. I also speak a bit of Irish, so that adds another language into the mix. And I don't know. So I don't know. I tend to dream in English, but I'll have dreams in other languages as well. It also, when I was living in France, a lot of my dreams did change to be French dreams where someone was like speaking French and Irish together and things like that. They become kind of intertwined, even though they're not even like similar, like they don't have roots that are similar as a language. So yeah, I think I dream in all of them. All of them kind of come in.
Okay, well, let's see with Oliver what he has to say about that.
I'm not very good at remembering my dreams. I never have been, but I have been. I am a big sleep talker, and I've been told that I sleep talk in Spanish and French. I have absolutely no idea what I'd be saying, and I imagine it's complete gibberish. But yeah, I'm sleep talking in both apparently. And just going back to, I think I'm in that transition phase that Lana was talking about, especially coming back from a summer of not having spoken a lot of Spanish and French. I'm really feeling that right now. I would say that once you get a lot of the basics down, the basics definitely come naturally to me. And there's several phrases and things that I can say very easily and not have to think about. So I won't go into English for several things. I can have certain conversations with my girlfriend who speaks Spanish and French as well, and we live in the house together. And we can do that, and there's not much thinking there. It's when it comes to a more complicated conversation that I think I am still doing that. Part of my transition phase of what I'm trying to do is I'm talking to myself a lot in Spanish and French. It's my way of kind of even if I'm not speaking to people or I'm not in a class, I'm still making sure that my brain is trying to come up with these things. And so speaking to myself out loud or thinking in my head and doing so in French and Spanish, and then if I can do it in one, can I do it in the other? That's my way of kind of making sure that even almost, unconsciously, I'm still trying to develop my brain and my comfortability in speaking and processing both languages. So yeah, it takes a while, but I think there's just that dedication, and you've got to be consistent with doing that to make sure that it will eventually, just like Lana said, one day you won't recognize it, and that's that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was saying in the presentation. If you make the effort, you're making the effort to speak to yourself, to practice and all that, and it's great. And finally, Louis, about the dreaming, in which language? You being multilingual as well.
Yeah, well, it's a weird one because for me, I've actually spent quite a bit of my life living in Spain because I've got family that live there. So Spanish has always seemed like more of a second language to me than French has, just because I've had more exposure to it. So like Ollie said as well, there's moments where I will naturally just speak to myself in Spanish because it's kind of like there's words that come more naturally in Spanish than in English. So it's just for me, for an example, like when I sneeze, saying Jesus comes more common to me than excuse me or bless you. It's like it just does. I think it's like a bit of a reflex at this point. It's because I've just heard it so many times that it just became natural to me. But I think in terms of dreaming, I don't remember in massive detail too many of the dreams that I have, but when I do, I think it's a bit like what Lorna said, where I think the kind of environment I'm in will structure that as well. So I think when I'm in France or in Spain, I think a lot of what I'm dreaming about or talking about is then in that language culture. So it will slightly flip over towards that. But I think it just depends on what situation you're in, really, for me.
Okay, thank you. And we've got a few questions in the chat. They're kind of linked. So, for example, were you fluent or are you fluent by the end of your undergrad year? So Lorna and Louis, this one is for you more than Oliver because you're still developing your skills there. So Lorna and Louis, what do you think?
I think yes, on paper, and I suppose my teachers who've examined me would like to say that I'm fluent. I'm a bit apprehensive to say that at this moment in time because I feel like my language was at its best when I was living in France. However, I am definitely at like a working proficiency. I can work in the language and communicate effectively in the language. There may be some things I don't understand, but in general, I can ask what they mean, and most people are absolutely fine with explaining to you what the word means. It's fine once you know how to express yourself and ask questions. Really, then you're halfway there. Like most of the way I learned like the vocabulary that I have now was from just asking questions about what the words meant when I heard them in conversation. If I heard something I didn't understand, but I got like the rest of it. And it's also that sort of thing of if you're reading a book and you don't understand one word, but the context around the word gives you more or less an idea of what that word means. And I think a lot of that is how I've kind of expanded on my skills in French as well, is kind of reading between the lines and getting the context of things. And, signs and gestures as well, they also help when it comes to understanding a foreign language and reaching a fluency.
Louis, if you have anything to add about that, otherwise I'm going to ask you another question, and then I'm going to move on to Oli because we've got quite a few questions and we only have 7 minutes left.
Okay.
How did you adapt to learn a language so fast? And also, how old were you when you started learning? And because there are 3 questions linked there, when did you realize, that's for all of you, when did you realize that you liked languages?
Okay,
so let's start with Louis and then Oliver, please.
I'll kind of reverse engineer that. I'll start with the one that's how old were you when you realize you like. Honestly, I can't remember, but I just remember it would have been from a young age. It would have been from probably, I suppose I started doing French in year 4, and I always enjoyed it, and I always found it interesting, and I've always grown up watching football, for example. So you get an understanding of different football teams around the world, and then obviously being Europeanly based, you see the Champions League, you hear the French in the song, you see the French teams participating in Spanish teams as well. For me, obviously, when I moved to Spain, we had a local Spanish team, which was Malaga, that at the time was still in La Liga, so we went to lots of their games and became immersed in that culture there, learned all the songs and the hymns and the anthems that they sing at the stadium. And it's for me, that's when I realized that it was properly a part of my life and was probably always going to be. And in terms of how to adapt, for me, I think it's probably going to be different for every person that we ask. But for me, having as much exposure to it in terms of being able to hear it and kind of just training my brain to be used to hearing the language. So I used to watch Netflix shows like Cyril mentioned before, that were just in French, maybe even with English subtitles, but just hearing the French and then being able to read the English if I didn't understand it, or without if I did, just to bridge that gap. I think sometimes we spoke about it before when it was with the English does your brain go back into English? I think it does, because it's your brain giving you a bit of a safety net in case you get a bit lost. But then I think the second that you're ready to make that leap, your brain just gets rid of it and you don't even notice that it's happened. But I think, yeah, just adapting, exposure, hearing the language, trying to speak it if you can, but especially hearing it, I think is really, really important for that.
Okay, Oli?
My interest in languages was very, very clear. It was born originally out of utter jealousy. We had friends in France from my mum. It was three girls. Two of them were twins. One of them was my age. The twins were a bit younger, and me and my sister used to go over and we'd play with them when we were maybe 4 or 5 or something like that. And we'd be speaking to them, and just in an instant like that, they could turn to each other and speak French, and me and my sister would have no idea what it was, and I hated that. I hated not being able to understand or join in their conversation. So it was originally born out of jealousy, and then when I started doing it, I realized just how much I enjoyed being able to speak an entirely different language. Like Louis said, I had a lot of interest in football, and I was obsessed with Barcelona when I was younger. So yeah, just it all, like I say, originally born out of jealousy, but then I realized the joys of speaking that language and what these people that were born with, that were just born bilingual, how lucky they are to have that. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Lana, about that?
Sure. So am I answering the question of how old was it when I realized?
Yeah, that.
Okay, sure. So I grew up in a small rural area in Ireland, and the primary school I went to very much promoted the Irish language. And a lot of that promotion came through concerts and that sort of thing. And that's actually how I got into really enjoying speaking another language. With Irish, I did a Scot Gaelic exchange with Selmer Ostig, which is a university in the Isle of Skye, where it was basically, we did like showcases and concerts for each other, and it was very much like an exchange in art and culture as well. And me and my Irish teacher at the time translated some popular songs into Irish, and then I sang them in Irish, and I kind of realized how much I enjoyed doing that, and I enjoyed that exchange of cultures as well. I realised then that I wanted to study French probably when I was about 17 or 18, so a bit later on. That was more down to, I just felt like I wanted to travel and go somewhere and be able to communicate with more people, and also be able to kind of see if I could really live my life in another language. And I guess my love for French came from, I guess there's like a rich art history and theatre culture that really drew me in, and from there it kind of just took off when I decided I would combine that. So I did English and French as my undergrad, so I could get the best of both worlds really and do both of my passions at the same time. So the love for languages was instilled from a young age with Irish, but I wasn't really sure where languages were taking me until I was around 17, I'd say, was when I properly decided I did want to study languages at university.
Okay, thank you. And finally, we have one last question, which is quite interesting. Do you basically have any tips or advice for taking A-level exam in languages? And that's a question from Notre Dame Sixth Form College, I think not far from Lancaster, actually, in the north, if I'm not mistaken. So let's start with you, Lana, as you were speaking. Let's carry on.
Sure. So I know it's like really stressful. I am someone who definitely gets very bad exam anxiety. But one of the things that definitely helped me was in terms of languages, I would record some answers for my speaking exam into my phone, and I'd put my headphones on, and I'd go for a run or I'd go for a walk with that on, so that I could still be implementing it in that part, and also to things that, whatever you enjoy, try and bring that into your prep for the exams, because at the end of the day, you will sit down and you will be thinking, things that come to your brain that under that stress, you often don't realize how much you actually have taken in, I can't emphasize enough how good just getting some sort of meditation and breathing exercises in. I know it's probably a lot of you like, oh yeah, I know I can breathe, whatever, but actually really just taking that time, especially before an exam, can really give you that like nice, calm, level-headedness going in. And also just remember that, you know, it is an exam, but it's not the be all and end all. You know, don't be putting yourself under so much pressure that you can't enjoy other things in your life, because it's not worth it really. You know, you can definitely just try and incorporate things. For example, I did a recipe book in French when I was doing my Irish Leaving Cert. I ended up, because like a lot of the questions were surrounded by culinary stuff and food in the comprehensive part of the exam. So I started writing down, like if I was learning to make a new dish, I started writing down them instructions in French and that sort of thing, and that really helped me. Another tip would be to make sure you're eating properly around your exams and get a good routine in. Routine is key. It really is. It just we are creatures of habit, and when we create these habits, it does then make us feel a bit more calm going into something like an A-level exam.
Okay, Louis and Oliver, I'm sorry, we will have to stop the session now because it's already after 1, okay? And I can, for myself, answer the last question that has just been asked in the chat. Was your first day abroad scary? Yes, it was. When I arrived from my year abroad, I was in Newcastle, and I was coming by bus opposite the big stadium, St. James's Park, and Newcastle had just had a game, and I arrived at the time about 45,000 people, Geordies, were leaving the stadium, and I had no mobile phone. It was in 98. I didn't know what to do. So yes, it is scary, but I'm still here and I survived. So yes, it is scary, but look at them. I'm sure it was scary for Lorna and Louis, and I'm sure Oliver is dreading it a little bit, but there's no reason. Okay. It's great. And it's, to be honest, the best year of my life. And I'm sure Lorna said that before. No problem there. So don't hesitate to do that.